I always knew my neighborhood was controlled by a notoriously overbearing HOA, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stumbled onto what I can only describe as liquid gold right underneath my garden, oil, bubbling up from a crack near my tomato patch after a particularly rainy week. It was the kind of sight you only expect to see in movies about Texas oil barons, but before I could even process what I had found, I heard the sharp, mechanical hum of the HOA golf cart pulling up to my driveway, and within seconds I was being told, no, ordered, to cease any activity that might disturb the uniform aesthetic value of the community. The woman speaking, our HOA president named Deborah, who had a permanent scowl stitched onto her face, held a laminated pamphlet covered in bylaw references like it was a holy text, pointing specifically to a section about unauthorized excavation. I tried to explain, badly I admit, that I hadn't excavated anything, that nature itself had exposed the oil, but Deborah's eyes were already glazing over with the smug satisfaction of someone who lived to enforce arbitrary rules. That's when the threat started. Fines for altering the garden without permission, citations for unauthorized geological interference, and something truly absurd called community destabilization liability, if my actions were deemed to lower property values for the homes around me. I didn't even know what half those terms meant, but Deborah had this ability to make up rules on the spot and convince everyone they'd been there all along. As the words flew at me, all I could think about was the oil, the dark, shimmering promise beneath my soil that could change my life forever, but the HOA was already trying to smother that future before it had even begun. That night, I dug into the community charter, a bloated document spanning over 200 pages, and realized something interesting. While there were clear rules against visible alterations to a garden, there was a legal gray area about subsurface exploration. Technically, if I wasn't modifying the appearance of my lawn, I could explore what lay beneath it. But of course that was a loophole the HOA would never openly admit existed. The next morning I rented some discrete soil analysis equipment from a local geological survey company, pretending to the rental office that I was just an amateur geologist with a keen interest in sediment layers, and got to work under the cover of my garden shed. What I found was even more mind-blowing than I expected. A massive, untapped reservoir that seemed to extend beneath half the neighborhood, a fossil fuel jackpot hiding directly under our cookie-cutter lawns and decorative fountains. I could hardly sleep that night, knowing that my yard sat atop a literal fortune, and yet the HOA still thought my biggest offense was letting my grass grow 2 inches too tall last spring. I realized quickly that if I wanted to profit from this, I'd have to play smarter than Deborah and her clipboard army. My first move was to install a fake irrigation system, a garden makeover that looked compliant but was secretly the perfect cover for a concealed drilling rig. The HOA saw me hauling in pipes and valves and assumed I was overcompensating for my less-than-stellar lawn, but below the surface, I was sinking a small but effective exploratory well right into the heart of the reservoir. I kept my operation quiet, oiling the equipment at night and disguising noise with a conveniently loud pool filter, all while Deborah continued sending me passive-aggressive notes about unauthorized lawn gnomes. Within 2 weeks, my garden was producing oil faster than I could store it, and I had to start selling it off to a local refinery under a fake company name, Garden Gold Resources. Every barrel I sold made the HOA's fines look like loose change from a couch cushion, but the more I profited, the more paranoid the HOA became. They knew something was off, my sudden enthusiasm for gardening upgrades, the way delivery trucks occasionally stopped by with suspiciously heavy packages, but they couldn't prove a thing. The HOA started holding emergency meetings to discuss community preservation, thinly veiled excuses to figure out what the hell was happening on my property, but I stayed 2 steps ahead, building fences, planting elaborate flower beds to block sight lines, and even hosting a fake garden club to distract from the deeper operation beneath the soil. As my bank account swelled, so did the HOA's desperation, and soon, Deborah was knocking on my door daily with new complaints. My sprinklers were too loud, my mulch was too dark for community standards, and my garden shed was unnaturally large for approved accessory structures. Every complaint was a thinly veiled attempt to dig into what I was really doing, but all it did was fuel my determination to outweed them. The deeper I drilled, the more I realized just how much oil was down there, enough to make every single house in the neighborhood worth pennies compared to the land underneath it. I wasn't just sitting on wealth, I was sitting on power the HOA couldn't comprehend, and for the first time in my life I felt like I had the upper hand. It was a strange sensation being a suburban oil tycoon hiding in plain sight, but I also knew that this was just the beginning. If the HOA thought they could stop me with lawn ordinances and noise complaints, they were about to learn that you can't regulate ambition, not when there's billions to be made. I stood in my garden that night, inhaling the scent of fresh oil mixed with fertilizer, and realized something important. This wasn't just my story anymore. This was a war, and my backyard was the battlefield. And no amount of laminated bylaws could stop what was coming next. I woke up one morning to find a brightly colored notice duct taped to my front door, the kind of neon paper that practically vibrates with hostility before you even read it, and there in bold, angry font was the latest salvo from the HOA. Notice of immediate compliance hearing, subject, suspected unauthorized industrial activity. It was the kind of thing you'd expect if you were running a bootleg fireworks factory in your garage, not tending to a slightly unconventional garden, but clearly, Deborah and her minions were no longer content with passive-aggressive fines and veiled threats. I knew they were getting suspicious. The increased foot traffic from delivery guys, my sudden obsession with garden gnome placement, the way my lawn seemed oddly greener despite the drought. But this was a new level of aggression even for them. The hearing was set for the following week, giving me exactly 7 days to either shut down my operation or prepare for a full-frontal legal assault from the HOA's so-called compliance committee, which was essentially just Deborah, her equally miserable husband Larry, and a retired CPA named Nancy who took her job way too seriously. I wasn't about to let a trio of lawn enthusiasts ruin my billion-dollar oil dream, so I kicked my operation into overdrive, working day and night to extract as much crude as possible before they could pull the plug, literally or legally. I installed a false floor in my shed, hiding a compact pumping system underneath a layer of innocent-looking gardening tools and fake bags of potting soil, making sure that even if Deborah stormed in uninvited, all she'd find was a suspiciously well-organized garden shed. Meanwhile, I started attending every single HOA meeting, plastering on a friendly smile, baking cookies, and playing the role of concerned homeowner to perfection, all while siphoning thousands of dollars worth of oil under their noses every single day. But Deborah wasn't stupid, evil and petty sure, but not stupid, and she began orchestrating random wellness checks on my property under the pretense of ensuring my garden complied with seasonal decoration policies. One afternoon she showed up with a clipboard and a suspiciously large measuring tape, claiming she was verifying the height of my ornamental grasses, but I knew the real reason. She was sniffing around for anything that could prove her suspicions about my operation. I started getting anonymous complaints from neighbors about strange noises at night, the rhythmic hum of my hidden pump, the occasional metallic clank when I adjusted the rig, and Deborah gleefully used these complaints as justification for an emergency noise abatement inspection, which was really just her excuse to barge into my backyard unannounced. By that point, I had camouflaged everything. My rig disguised as a rainwater collection system, my crude storage tanks hidden inside fake compost bins, but the pressure was mounting. The HOA sent me a 45-page violation packet, accusing me of everything from unauthorized soil modification, to potential groundwater contamination, to operating a hazardous industrial site within a residential zone, each charge more ridiculous than the last but all of them adding up to one clear message: shut down or get buried in legal hell. I knew that even if none of these violations held water in an actual court, the HOA wasn't aiming for legal victory, they were trying to drown me in bureaucracy until I gave up. But they underestimated just how stubborn I could be when there were billions of dollars literally seeping out of my lawn. I filed counter-complaints, requesting full audits of the HOA's finances, demanding proof that their noise ordinances were legally binding, and submitting endless requests for evidence of any actual harm caused by my alleged industrial activity. The more paperwork I threw back at them, the more they squirmed because the truth was, like most HOAs, they ran more on intimidation than actual enforceable law. But Deborah wasn't done yet. She pulled her nuclear option, calling in a state environmental inspector to investigate my property for unreported hazardous waste storage. When the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand and skepticism on his face, I knew this was my biggest test yet. I gave him the grand tour, pointing out my compost bins, full of oil barrels, my irrigation system, piping crude straight into underground storage tanks, and my rainwater collection unit, a cleverly disguised separator. To my utter surprise, and Deborah's absolute horror, the inspector, who clearly hated HOAs even more than I did, found my setup ingenious, and after confirming that I hadn't actually broken any state laws, he left with a chuckle, muttering something about wishing he could do the same in his backyard. Deborah was livid, but she wasn't finished. Within hours, the HOA issued a community emergency resolution, declaring my property a threat to residential serenity, and demanding that I immediately cease all disruptive activities. It was the kind of overreach that bordered on satire, but I knew they were desperate now, and desperate people make mistakes. I took the emergency resolution, framed it, and hung it right next to my first oil royalty check, because for me that document wasn't a threat, it was proof I was winning. I started buying up shares in the HOA's management company, quietly inserting myself into their financial ecosystem, knowing that if I couldn't beat them from the outside, I could rot them from within. Every battle they started only gave me more leverage, more attention, and ironically, more power, because the more they fought me, the more I looked like the underdog folk hero to the rest of the neighborhood. Neighbors who once ignored me started quietly cheering me on, secretly rooting for the guy who dared to stick it to the HOA overlords, and some even slipped me tips about Deborah's personal vendettas and shady bookkeeping. My garden was no longer just an oil well, it was a symbol of resistance, and every barrel I sold felt like a victory against the tyranny of suburban bureaucracy. But I knew the war was far from over. Deborah wasn't going to stop until either I was crushed or she was dethroned, and frankly, I was ready for both. After all, I wasn't just drilling for oil anymore, I was drilling a hole straight through the heart of the HOA itself, and there was no turning back. With the HOA breathing down my neck and the community torn between supporting me and fearing Deborah's wrath, I knew I needed to escalate my strategy, not just to protect my oil operation but to make sure I could control the entire narrative. That's when I did something even I hadn't planned for. I approached one of my biggest enemies, Nancy the retired CPA, and made her an offer she couldn't refuse. A cut of the profits in exchange for her silence and, more importantly, her insider knowledge of HOA finances and bylaws. At first, she recoiled like I'd asked her to rob a bank, clutching her pearl necklace with visible offense. But then I casually slid a folder across her kitchen table, filled with detailed documentation of Deborah's misuse of HOA funds. Things like unauthorized spa weekends billed as leadership retreats, and HOA-funded landscaping for her personal vacation home. Nancy's eyes flickered with that unique accountant's hunger for exposing bad bookkeeping, and within minutes she was all in, becoming my mole inside the HOA's inner circle. Through Nancy, I gained access to the HOA's internal communications, giving me a real-time feed of every petty scheme they concocted to shut me down, from bogus water usage violations to secret plans to change zoning rules mid-conflict. But with information came risk, because the more I knew, the more they knew I was dangerous, and Deborah, sensing her grip slipping, escalated to outright sabotage. One night, I came home to find my garden flooded, my irrigation lines cut, and my equipment tampered with, oil seeping into the ground in what was clearly meant to look like an environmental accident. Deborah's fingerprints were all over it. Her style of petty destruction was as obvious as her neon pink lawn flamingos, but I couldn't prove it directly without blowing Nancy's cover. Instead, I doubled down, reinforcing my system with industrial-grade security, installing motion sensors disguised as decorative garden lights, and even hiring a retired oil rig engineer from Craigslist to help me build a fully subterranean backup system. If they wanted a fight, I was going to fight dirty. Meanwhile, the HOA launched a smear campaign, circulating flyers accusing me of endangering children with toxic fumes, and claiming my garden was a ticking time bomb ready to explode and take the neighborhood with it. The irony was delicious. After all, my setup was probably safer than half the aging gas lines running under our streets, but the panic worked, and suddenly my allies started getting cold feet, afraid to be associated with the oil guy. The pressure mounted further when a news crew showed up, tipped off by someone, spoiler, it was Deborah, about illegal oil drilling in a suburban backyard. I played it cool, giving them a perfectly rehearsed speech about sustainable microdrilling and energy independence, spinning my operation as a green innovation. And against all odds, the story went viral. Overnight, I wasn't just a suburban oil man, I was a folk hero to anti-HOA activists, libertarians, tech bros obsessed with disruptive industries, and even a few eccentric venture capitalists who started calling me with offers to scale the concept. But with fame came exposure, and the state government, now aware of my backyard bonanza, started sniffing around, wondering why they hadn't received any official permits, tax filings, or environmental reports. I realized I had a narrow window before the red tape strangled me completely, so I made my boldest move yet. I partnered with a shadowy independent refinery company known for operating in regulatory gray zones, essentially laundering my garden oil into the mainstream supply chain under the guise of experimental biofuel testing. The money started flowing faster than the oil itself, and for a brief, glorious moment, I thought I had won, until my garden caught fire. It was an obvious arson job, flames erupting suspiciously at the exact spot where my main wellhead poked just beneath the surface, and while the fire department managed to contain it before it spread, the damage was catastrophic. The equipment was ruined, the soil contaminated, and my carefully hidden infrastructure exposed for all to see. Deborah stood on her porch the next morning, sipping coffee with the smug satisfaction of a queen who had finally crushed the rebel. But what she didn't know was that I'd already anticipated this kind of attack. Months earlier, I'd secretly drilled a secondary well, not in my garden but beneath the community park, the one spot no one ever suspected because the HOA themselves maintained it. While they focused all their rage and fines on my yard, the real money was already flowing from under their own playground. The fire was bad, sure, but it was a distraction. And while Deborah and her cronies were busy celebrating my defeat, I was finalizing a deal to sell mineral rights not just under my property, but under half the neighborhood, thanks to a sneaky clause in the original developer's land deeds that technically allowed individual homeowners to lease their subsurface rights to third parties. Deborah had fought me over a single garden, but I had quietly acquired drilling rights under 14 neighboring properties, all leased to me by homeowners who happily took my cash in exchange for looking the other way. By the time Deborah realized what had happened, it was too late. I wasn't just a guy with a backyard well anymore. I was the de facto landlord of the oil beneath our entire street, and every barrel pulled from that reservoir made her property, and her power, worth less. The HOA had declared war on me, but I hadn't just survived. I had become the oil baron king of Maplewood Estates, and there wasn't a single bylaw left that could stop me now. The morning after Deborah realized I controlled the subsurface rights beneath half the neighborhood, she called an emergency meeting, a level of HOA panic so rare it required 2 emergencies in the subject line, and dragged every homeowner into the clubhouse at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. I walked in fashionably late, wearing a cowboy hat I definitely didn't earn and sunglasses indoors like a man who knew he had already won, because at that point, I wasn't just a rogue homeowner, I was a full-blown energy mogul operating inside enemy lines. Deborah's voice trembled with barely contained fury as she accused me of everything from destroying property values to engaging in illegal mineral theft, a term that doesn't even exist, but HOA logic operates somewhere between fever dream and small claims court. She even tried to claim that oil drilling violated the HOA's rules about noise after 9 p.m., as if backyard oil extraction was just a particularly loud leaf blower. I let her rant, silently passing out printed copies of every lease agreement I'd signed with my neighbors, each one legally granting me access to drill beneath their lots, and because I'd structured the deals as private agreements between individuals, the HOA had no legal standing to block a single drop of oil. The room shifted as homeowners realized I wasn't their enemy, I was their payday, their golden goose, and within minutes, people were lining up to ask if I wanted to lease their subsurface rights too. Deborah's face went sheet white as her power evaporated in real time, but I wasn't done. I stood up, cleared my throat, and announced that I had also quietly acquired controlling interest in the HOA's management company, using shell corporations to buy out their contracted vendor during the chaos of my legal battles. Effective immediately, Deborah no longer worked for the HOA, she worked for me. The room erupted into chaos, half the crowd cheering, the other half trying to process how their local villain had just become their corporate overlord. Deborah stormed out, but not before knocking over a plate of complimentary danishes, and I could feel her spirit cracking under the weight of defeat. Over the next week, I dismantled the HOA from the inside, slashing pointless fines, repealing ridiculous rules, and even legalizing garden flamingos just to rub salt in Deborah's wounds. But while the neighborhood celebrated their newfound freedom, I was orchestrating my final play, the sale of my entire operation from the wells to the leases to the mineral rights, bundled into a tidy package and pitched to a hungry energy conglomerate desperate to secure new domestic supply. The deal closed for $2.8 billion, tax advantage thanks to some clever structuring by my very own mole, Nancy, who by this point was not only my accountant but also my reluctant best friend and co-conspirator. With my fortune secured, I threw the neighborhood a farewell party, complete with a bounce house, a mechanical bull, and an ice sculpture of an oil derrick, because subtlety had left the building months ago. Deborah of course wasn't invited, but she watched from her window, curtains twitching like an old cartoon villain as my guests toasted to the man who broke the HOA. Before I left, I installed a commemorative plaque in my garden, the spot where it all began, reading, "Here lies the first well of Maplewood oil, in defiance of tyranny and bad landscaping rules." As I drove away, now richer than I had ever dreamed and free from HOA hell forever, my phone buzzed with a new email, a proposal from a developer interested in building a luxury housing development on some empty land I owned across town. It was a perfect, untouched slice of suburbia, just waiting for someone like me to install a brand new HOA. After all, who better to design the rules than the man who mastered the loopholes? I laughed so hard I nearly swerved off the road, realizing that my next fortune wasn't just in oil, it was in creating the very kind of suburban nightmare I'd just escaped, but this time, I'd be the puppet master pulling the strings. They say you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain, but I had done something better. I'd become both. And as the sun set over my oil-stained lawn, I knew one thing for sure: no one, not even Deborah, could stop me now. The HOA was dead. The oil was mine. And the suburbs would never be the same.